Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another in a series of conversations with humanities scholars on the subject of North Dakota culture and history. I'm Marty Perry, and I represent the State Historical Society of North Dakota. I'll act as your moderator for today's discussion. With me is Dr. Richard Striner. Dr. Striner is the Chief Historian for the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, President of the Washington Art Deco Society, and co-author of Washington Deco, a study of buildings constructed in our nation's capital during the 20s, 30s, and early 40s. The subject of our conversation today are the architectural forces present in Washington during that period, architectural forces which reflect national trends, which also had an impact on the design of the North Dakota state capitol. This conversation is part of an ongoing series at the Heritage Center, which takes as a subject the history and architecture of North Dakota's Capitol building. The series is funded through a grant from the North Dakota Humanities Council to the Historical Society. As always, we appreciate the support that the Council gives to our efforts and makes programs such as this possible. Let's begin by introducing Dr. Striner, welcoming him here, and tell us a little bit, Dr. Striner, just to set the stage for the discussion, by describing the most prominent buildings on Constitution Avenue, Pennsylvania Avenue, in Washington.
Well, the area you're talking about, Marty, is one of the most prominent in the monumental core of the nation's capital. When tourists come to Washington, D.C., the area we call Federal Triangle in the land that lies between Constitution and Pennsylvania Avenue. Federal Triangle contains places like the National Archives. It forms a dignified backdrop to the mall and acts as a transition, some would say a buffer, between the mall and downtown commercial Washington. The buildings between Pennsylvania and Constitution Avenue that we now take for granted and that are part of the federal architectural repertoire that strikes tourists when they come to Washington. These buildings, which look like they've been there through the ages, have only been there for around 50 years, most of them. Throughout the 19th century, this area was filled with commercial row buildings, marketplaces, and at the turn of the century, particularly in 1901, when an important commission, the McMillan Commission, was trying to do some long-range planning to uphold the grandeur of the nation's capital and extend the l'enfant plan into the 20th century, the McMillan Commission tried to come up with a comprehensive plan for the monumental core, and the idea of a federal office enclave at that point in the city dates to the turn of the century. Final authorization was given by Congress in the 1920s. Construction began in the late 20s and was completed in the 1930s. And the buildings are overwhelmingly classical, by which we mean derived in form and character and ornamentation from Greco-Roman antiquity. Now, these buildings comprise most of the architecture that occupies this important wedge formed by Constitution Avenue, which forms the northern boundary of the mall, and Pennsylvania Avenue, which angles in from the White House on a diagonal to meet it. The area does contain some earlier buildings. A building from an earlier phase of classicism, the District of Columbia City Hall, essentially, which dates to the turn of the century, an earlier form of architecture that salutes Greco-Roman antiquity, and also a building that was completed in the 1890s that a number of people were unhappy with from the moment it was finished because architectural tastes were then in the process of changing, and that people sought to have demolished for years and years until the 1970s when preservationists rallied to the cause of saving it. And that is the building we know as the old post office building, this huge towering monument to Richardsonian Romanesque Victoriana, which is tall, Gothic-inspired architecture, frequently constructed of stone. And for years, people felt that this big post office building was utterly incompatible with the flowing, horizontal, dignified grandeur of Federal Triangle. But now we have a happy coexistence between these buildings.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now, you're saying that then at the turn of the century, between the 19th and 20th centuries, this classical styling became very prominent stamp upon Washington. However, it had a very much earlier presence, so that there's some continuity between the styling of the city's very earliest days and at the period when it really attains its prominence as a world capital. What were some of the original influences and aspirations possibly that led to the adoption of the classical plan?
Well, classicism, as you've implied, is a recurrent theme in Western design. We have episodes of classicism through the centuries, the Renaissance, the Baroque, 18th century classicism, and the founding of Washington was powerfully influenced by 18th century classicism, and particularly the effort of the founders to achieve a virtuous political republic. The whole legacy of the revolution in republican institutions with a small r, republican institutions meaning the absence of a monarch, the absence of a hereditary aristocracy. The founders looked to the classical past for models, both models of how to build a good republic and also models as to the decline and fall of republics that were ill-constructed, and a great deal of concern went into the political architecture of a republican system, which we're now paying homage to in the bicentennial of the Constitution. And the public buildings of that time, it was hoped, would symbolically represent and inculcate the virtues of self-government through a republican political system. And the designs, the original design for the U.S. Capitol, which was never fully executed, the design for the White House, the design for early public buildings, all were inspired by classicism fraught with this kind of symbolism. But Washington, from the outset, was a city in a state of some upheaval. It was a brand new city carved out of the wilderness, and there was some irony in the sight of these edifices arising in the mud, essentially, and people for years ridiculed Washington about its aspirations and failure to completely fulfill them.
So at the beginning of the 19th century, this was the kind of mental forces or influences which brought about a taste for the classical and the symbolism entailed with all of that. At the end of the 19th century, a whole different set of forces prevailed. Certainly the city and the nation weren't just at the very beginning of their development, but they were well into the Industrial Revolution, which led to a profound number of changes for the lives of all of Americans. And at this time, again, we see classical architecture invoked as, and having some sort of philosophical and calming effect, perhaps, upon these people. Could you describe this in a little bit more detail?
You want me to talk about late Victorian influences in Washington architecture?
Sure, exactly.
Well, Washington's architecture has never achieved the stability that some have wished through the years. And this is by no means unusual. Cities all over the world are in constant transition, but given the ideals for Washington, it's often been a source of chagrin to observers that the city could never quite seem to settle into a definitive character. There were aspirations, but tastes would change. So it was through the 19th century. After the Civil War, the forces of Victorian design took powerful hold in Washington. Classicism remained, but it was also combined with the Gothic impulse that was so widely reflected in Victoriana. And there was a lot of building done in Washington during these years, and Washington has a rich legacy of ornate, vertical, heavily elaborated Victorian design. And Washington was simply in tune with prevailing Victorian-era tastes in this respect. What did Victorian design symbolize? I could go on and on about what it symbolized.
Well, what's more important, I suppose, are the forces which brought it back to the classicism at the end of the Victorian period. Yeah. What kind of social forces, perhaps, might account for the movement away from the the eclecticism of the Victorian period, back to something that put Washington back in touch with its roots, its architectural roots.
Well, Victorian eclecticism represented a wide range of things, and to some aesthetes, various eclectic tendencies in Victoriana had idealistic origins, but to a number of social critics in America during those years, ornate Victoriana seemed to symbolize society going wrong. Mark Twain's novel, The Gilded Age, a number of novels critical of the what seemed to be the American retreat from reform ideals in the aftermath of the Civil War, the cynicism and corruption of the Grant period in the 1870s, the permissiveness toward domineering captains of industry who achieved tremendous things in the industrialization of this country, but often at what seemed to be a very severe price. Factories that were oppressive places to work, slum towns adjacent to them where workers were kept at the mercy of the company store, environmental degradation of one sort or another. The list could go on, and in particular, there were forces of economic grievance that were building during these decades, forcing the critique of overall social policy toward a crisis by the 1890s, and particularly the economic crisis besetting Midwestern and Far Western farmers. There was a severe depression in the 1890s. There was a widespread movement in this part of the country and others, the populist movement, protest movement against economic grievances, and the election of 1896 between William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley was an extremely bitter one. And to a number of social critics, Victorian architecture, which was flaunted by the rich, the powerful, the successful, those who had made their money in an industrial enterprise, this seemed to be the mark of a sinful generation. Voluptuous, excessive, worldly, and materialistic, a generation that would not pay heed to certain basic moral principles. Love thy neighbor, deal justly, and there was a movement among reformers in the 1890s called the Social Gospel Movement. William Jennings Bryan had a powerful religious message in his political program. I don't mean to get too far afield, but there was a widespread longing at the turn of the century for reform, for return to virtue, and classicism, as is so often the case, seemed to provide a design vehicle for expressing this desire. And in the early 20th century, as the progressive era under the leadership of people like Theodore Roosevelt took hold, classicism seemed to be a symbol of a big cleanup campaign. We've been on a binge. We're going to get back to our roots, the ideal of Republican virtue, and build a society that's worthy of this exciting new century.
Right, right. So it represented to the people a way to strip away all of that excessiveness. And the architecture not only is philosophically grounded upon stripping away, but it's visually grounded in the same sort of effect, a very clean look marked by the Greek temple form. Mm-hmm. Okay, how long did this have a presence in the design of buildings in our nation's capital?
Oh, it was really the impetus for a wave of classicism that would last for 3 or 4 decades, and which would really reach its apotheosis in the 1930s and 40s, giving the American people many of the monuments we now take for granted as essential Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court building, the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials, the National Archives, part of the Federal Triangle Project, the National Gallery of Art. So much of what people come to see in tourist Washington derives from those years and from that wave of classicism.
Okay. Outside of Washington, during the first decades of this century, what other kind of architectural milieu was beginning to gain some acceptance? Certainly classicism wasn't the only architectural mode that people were designing in.
Oh, no, not at all. There are always a wide range of movements in architecture, and There were a number of modern design movements, both throughout the world and in the United States, movements to design in a way that was suitable for an age of reform, but as opposed to the classicist belief that it was best to reach back to the touchstones of classical order and reaffirm those, modernists, I wouldn't say always, frequently believed that it was best to greet the new century with a new departure in design, to reject what the modernists would consider a slavish repetition of historical motifs and forms, and try to create a wholly new form of architecture. And not all modernists would argue this, or not with the same emphasis, but by the 1920s and 30s, a powerful consensus was beginning to emerge in modernism, building around this idea.
Okay. Could you characterize very briefly the kind of styles or the kind of exterior elaboration that the modernists would have for their buildings? How was it set apart from classical design?
Well, there was a wide range within modernism, and I don't mean to oversimplify any of this. Classicism and modernism were not the only two alternatives either, and there was a range within classicism, a range within modernism. There were many different ways that modernism could manifest itself. For example, if you consider the rather romantic modernism of Frank Lloyd Wright, in contrast to the modernism of the German Bauhaus, they're very, very different indeed. A lot of what people consider 20th century modernism, the glass box, this derives from the work of French and German designers that was introduced to the United States in large part through an influential exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art that was held in 1932, accompanied by a book called The International Style. The authors argued that this clean, stripped, crisp form of glass and steel architecture was the common vocabulary for international modern design. But there were a wide range of modernisms. Many of them quite romantic if you look at what was going on in Holland and in the United States as well.
Good. So we have on one hand the very retroactive, very past-oriented classical styles, and something that might be considered forward-looking or future-oriented in the international style or the modernist camp.
Mm-hmm.
Situated between both of these, then, is Art Deco, would you say? Yes. What are some of the ways that Art Deco is at least characterized and may have borrowed from both the backward-looking and the forward-looking architectural camps at the time?
Before I answer that question, I just want to say one more thing about modernism, classicism. In the view of some people at the time, and in the view of some people today, there's an essential antagonism between classicism and modernism, but this is not necessarily the case. Classicism has been restated and reformulized again and again through the centuries, and in fact, some modernists, particularly Le Corbusier, the Swiss-born French designer who wrote very influential polemics in the 1920s, was arguing that modernism could be a new reformulation of classical principles, and his book Toward a New Architecture was full of comparisons of the Parthenon and modern architecture and so on. Now, as to Art Deco, particularly when you have what seems to be a polarization in anything, but in this case in design, it's only natural for attempts to be made to mediate the either-or choice that seems to be offered. And there were a number of middle-range design movements in the 1920s and 30s that sought to bridge the gap between, let us say, self-conscious traditionalism and self-conscious modernism. And there really was a war going on between them. Month after month, you read the journals and the polemics get more and more vicious. And between these, a number of designers tried to design buildings and furnishings in a way that was unmistakably contemporary, but which was free enough to borrow and blend different forms, different inspirations. Art Deco is a modern abbreviation for a movement introduced well, a movement whose origins can be traced back for decades, but which essentially fused in 1925 at an exposition in Paris. The complete title was rather a mouthful in French and in English. In French it was L'Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes, which in English translates to International Exposition of the Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts. And in the 60s, Art Deco was coined as a quick way to refer to that movement. It was an exhibition sponsored by the French government. It was an exhibition that tried to create design that was new and modern, but which drew from all sorts of inspirations. It drew from exotic realms, the American Indian Southwest, the Polynesian influences from the Far East, African influences, and in historical terms, it could borrow from the far distant past, including the classical past, Greco-Roman, but also from the more exotic ancient past, ancient Egypt, Aztec, pyramids. King Tut's tomb was opened in the early 20s, and there was a big craze for Egyptology. And then it could also salute the modernists' futuristic bias, but again through a sort of light-hearted, popular range of expression, fantasy images from the futurists envisioned in the world of Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. It would merge all of these things together to create a rich and jazzy blend of design. And in America, it caught on very fast. The Chrysler Building, which was completed in 1930, then the tallest building in the world, flaunted this style from its crown, and it diffused throughout the United States to five and dimes, through diners, and so forth. In the 1930s, an additional variant was added, a vibrant, streamlined style, inspired by the works of industrial designers who were seeking for aerodynamic reasons to streamline cars and trains and airplanes, and this became an additional craze, and the two often combine.
So we have, at the end of the 20s, the beginning of the 30s, at least two Art Deco aesthetic trends, one for the very vertical, maybe a jagged-edged, and at the same time, and a little bit later, a horizontal and streamlined effect, the moderne. How did this play upon the continued construction within the nation's capital? I know in the early 30s, plenty of support was made available through WPA, through New Deal programs to construct new buildings within the nation's capital and elsewhere throughout the country. How did architects respond to the imperatives of not only the classicism, which had the rich tradition in Washington, but the constant impulse of the modernist school, the people of the international style, and then situated maybe somewhere between these, the people who were designing within the Art Deco mode?
Mm-hmm. Well, Washington and New Deal architecture in Washington was a mixed bag as far as these influences goes. Classicism had become very definitely enthroned in official Washington over the preceding decade since the turn of the century. And with the creation of the Commission on Fine Arts in the 1910s to oversee the implementation of the Macmillan Commission's recommendations, you had institutionalized a number of forces that upheld classicism as the correct mode for government architecture. And the personal tastes of many of the elected leaders at that time, particularly Franklin Roosevelt's penchant for clean line simplicity and classicism underscored this. So it was heavily classical, but the New Deal program throughout the United States also involved significant components of modernism in many of the experimental ventures in social and community planning, in the relief programs, in the short-term revitalization or redevelopment programs. The Tennessee Valley Authority, for example, a very important expression of modernist design, engineering as art in the landscape. It was very self-conscious. Roland Vanck, the chief architect for TVA, was quite conscious of this. the planned communities, the satellite towns built around certain American cities as a demonstration of urban planning, involved significant infusions of modernism. So the New Deal program encompassed many things, and Art Deco as well. But the feud between the traditionalists and the modernists was really raging during these years, and attempts to mediate the feud drew, understandably, a lot of attention. And there was a building done in Washington. There were a number of buildings done in the 20s and 30s that seemed to show how modernism and classicism could be synthesized. One of the most important ones in Washington was the Folger Shakespeare Library building that was completed in 1932, designed by an important French-trained architect, Paul-Philippe Cret. That's C-R-E-T, Cret, and he designed a number of important monuments in Washington. But the Folger was widely praised for giving society the best of both worlds and creating a compromise. And it provided a model for a number of attempts in New Deal public building to defer to an extent to modernism, if only to say, look, cool it. You know, we feel there's a way we can do justice to your objectives and concerns without abandoning classicism. So this is a tendency that was prevalent in a lot of New Deal buildings, especially in Washington. And Art Deco ornamentation would provide a nice way to give a little bit of jazzy embellishment, a bit of ornamentation at key points throughout the building. I must say that many of the radical modernists were utterly unappeased by this and looked with the utmost disdain upon the creations of the architectural creations in New Deal Washington. And as we're going to discuss tomorrow, there was an attempt by the modernists to force the building of a modernist museum on the Mall in the late 30s, and the classicists stopped that, and then the modernists struck back, and it was a bad scene in a lot of ways.
Is there an easy way to characterize the two different worlds of construction which were going on in Washington during the 30s, the subsidized federal construction program and the privately sponsored commercial construction, maybe movie houses, apartment buildings, and things of that nature? Within the stylistic tradition of Art Deco, is there much overlap? Is there much similarity between the two kinds of construction, or are they just worlds apart?
Well, there are differences and similarities as well. Naturally, in commercial construction, you're going to have a more freewheeling approach to architecture than you do in most public buildings. And particularly in these years, Art Deco was an extremely vibrant style, and in some cases pointedly eccentric. The crown of the Chrysler Building, many of the jazzy movie houses across the country, which particularly during the Depression needed to draw people in to spend their money and convince them that the reason why you're spending your hard-earned cash here is to get a little bit of needed relief from the grim realities that we're dealing with. So there was a lot of escapism in 1930s movies. You go to see some of these Busby Berkeley movie musicals, and they're zany. That's a great part of their appeal and their charm. And the movie houses reflected this. But in Washington, there were apparently very conscious attempts to reconcile the necessity for decorative splurges in commercial architecture with the very widespread desire to maintain a dignified appearance of the nation's capital, and particularly in movie theaters. We have found that the normal or the frequent use of a towering sign or pylon above the marquee of the theater was suppressed within the limits of the District of Columbia. Instead, you find it in the Washington suburbs, but in the District of Columbia itself, there emerged this building type, the Washington Theater of the 1930s, where it's far more restrained. The Greyhound bus terminal in Washington, was done in very subdued tan limestone, as opposed to Greyhound terminals elsewhere across the country that were decked out in neon and Carrara glass, that is colored opaque glass, and various forms of new materials that seem to romanticize the age of speed and progress and excitement. The Greyhound terminal in Washington was a sculpted and exciting building, but the materials were subdued. So you have differences but similarities between the official architecture and the commercial.
The materials are very important in defining the effect of Art Deco, and a lot of people wouldn't have the opportunity to get inside some of the buildings that have influences from within that style to see whether the outside of the building and the inside are consistent in the amount of elaboration. Take us inside some of the buildings that strike you as being very well ornate on the inside, and tell us a little bit about whether there is that difference in a very austere and stripped down outside of these federal buildings, for instance. Are they equally as plain on the inside, or do they have something more in tune and in keeping with the spirit of the Paris 1925 Paris Exposition, which was heavy laden with fine decorative pieces?
Mm-hmm. Well, one is frequently surprised, as you suggest, and it's hard to generalize. Some buildings were consistent throughout, either consistent in terms of having a very active design program on the exterior matched by the interior, or a very subdued decorative program matched by an equally restrained interior. But in some cases, yes, one can find a building that might seem quite sedate, and then go inside and you find, wow, this amazing compensation within. One of the examples of that comes to mind is the annex completed for the Library of Congress in Washington, begun, I think, in 35, completed in 39. And on the exterior, it's well, James Good at the Smithsonian calls it Greco-Deco. It's sort of synthesis of classicism with some of the massing inspired by Art Deco and streamlining. But it's a quiet hybrid, obviously deferential to the classical tradition of Washington. And then you go inside, and there's this rich use of lustrous bronze and aluminum and lotus motifs in the elevator lobby, and very sumptuous interior in relative terms. You go to the original Library of Congress building begun in the 1890s, and it's this tremendous palace of beautifully detailed ornamentation, and the 30s building pales by comparison. But still, compared to some buildings that have been built in more recent years that are extremely stark and I think impoverished in that way. The 39 Library of Congress Annex has a very rich interior. Take the Justice Department building in Federal Triangle. This was done by a Philadelphia firm, Zanzinger, Borey, and Madari, and the exterior is very classical, but with a few little whimsical touches here and there, aluminum torchère lamps that are inspired by Art Deco and so forth. But when you get inside, then you find these improbable little delights. There's a ceiling in one of the gateway entrances to the building that the architect subcontracted to a craftsman named John Joseph Early, who had a studio just outside Washington where he produced this elaborate work in concrete mosaic. And it's this beautiful polychrome or multicolor ceiling done in panels of concrete mosaic in the most ornate shapes and color arrangements, and so improbable. You for the life of you wouldn't know it was there unless you just started poking around the building or had studied the building and went to see it. So you could find this sort of thing quite often.
Continuing on the theme of the decoration, the artistic embellishments on the interiors and exteriors of the buildings, plenty of this work on the federal buildings was sponsored by the government through WPA and arts programs, Was there any attempt to impose upon the artists certain design motifs, maybe to operate in an edifying way, in a symbolic way, to try to encourage people to look beyond its artistic appeal to have some deeper social meaning?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very, very large subject, and I could talk for a very long time about it. Most of the artwork that was done in federal buildings came through the Treasury Department through a program called PWAP, or Public Works of Art Project. And some of the movers and shakers there were modernists in their own right, particularly a man named Edward Bruce. Many of them were quite comfortable with the reform themes in social realist artwork that was prevalent during the New Deal. There were controversies, yes, controversies over, in particular over the use of abstract art, completely non-representational art, which really didn't show up all that much. Most of the mural work was in the mode that the art historians call social realism, or simplified realism, and they would depict a wide range of themes. If you go into the Justice Department building, you have the sort of thing you would expect to a certain extent, portrayals of great lawgivers through the ages from ancient times to the present. But you also have some of the most extraordinary things, not just idealistic portrayals of social reform or the need for social reform. I mean, you can find that throughout New Deal Washington and federal buildings around the country, heroic workmen building a new and better society, or common men, the common people portrayed as they live and work, which naturally conveyed the sense that the government was to serve the people and was to look after their welfare, but also respond to the people's own indications as to program and need. In addition to all this, in places like the Justice Department, there are some of the most extraordinary, very controversial, I think, forms of artistic expression, almost surrealistic. In the law library of the Justice Department building, there are these mural panels that portray various forms of miscarriage of justice, corruption, bribery, false witness, and I would assume that some of the explicit messages in this might have made a number of the occupants of that building rather uncomfortable from time to time. The artists seem to have been given rather free rein in many cases.
So there wasn't anything like the Macmillan Commission, which was organized well before the period of construction we're talking about, that attempted to exert a very overt control on the images and the means of conveying these images to the people.
Well, the New Deal program was thrown together very fast and was changing quite frequently through the 1930s, and one of Franklin Roosevelt's administrative hallmarks was the replicative setting up of a whole range of bureaus that overlapped into one another's work, and his critics like to attribute this to sloppy management, and maybe in some cases there was some justice to that, but the intention frequently was to set up a sort of yardstick process among different approaches to program and administration to see what worked best. Roosevelt was very frank about his desire to experiment. He said in a famous statement of the early 1930s, he was committing his administration to bold, persistent experimentation. He said something like, let us be honest enough to try a course of action, If it doesn't work, try another. Admit it frankly and try another, but above all, try something. It was a national emergency, the worst depression the country had ever faced. And as a result of this, you had a rather far-flung distribution of programs and authorities, and you would have Harry Hopkins doing one thing and Harold Ickes doing something similar but different in other ways, and there was a dispersion of authority, and you had a number of programs coming, going, and the result was that a lot of things would just happen. And you didn't have this tight oversight of the whole thing. But there were a lot of controversies in public art in those years, some of it in the private sector. Famous mural in Rockefeller Center that contained a picture of Lenin, and then the Rockefellers understandably got upset and it had to be painted out, and some of the work commissioned by Edsel Ford out in Dearborn, socially controversial scenes, but it was quite notable, the 1930s, for producing a lot of very frank and controversial public art.
In keeping with the almost experimental nature of the bureaucracy in Washington, do we see the same kind of experimentation going on in the architecture of the buildings that housed the different bureaucracies which were being tried on a trial and error basis? Do we see the same kind of willingness to break with tradition to some degree? Certainly they couldn't throw out completely this heavy-laden tradition of classicism, but do we see in some way, maybe through the artwork or maybe in experimental uses of classicism in an architectural sense, that same kind of experimentation, willingness to try a new program?
Not so much in Washington, but more so around the country. The sense, I think, that the policymakers had about the nation's capital was that you don't mess around with that. The needs transcend the present and have to bespeak a sense of responsibility to the past and to the future to promote continuity. There was a real sense of custodianship, of stewardship regarding the nation's capital, and classicism seemed to be the most responsible way of upholding that responsibility. But outside of Washington, there, yes, it seemed to be a freer situation, and one could try modernism to one extent or another, and especially in programs that had to be set up fast and carried out quickly. Modernism did seem to lend itself to that because you didn't have to spend a lot of time designing elaborate ornamentation. You just put together the bare bones of the thing, and purpose is clear, do it. Public housing, for example. In the early years of the New Deal, before the courts declared it unconstitutional, the Public Works Administration, PWA, actually directly built, the federal government through that agency directly built housing. It cleared slums. Up in Brooklyn, there was a multi-block project called the Williamsburg Project where they just leveled all of these foul slums and created housing that may seem a little bit severe today, but was a decided improvement over the hideous stuff that had been there. And it was done in very clean-cut modernism. The Green Towns program, again, which was a mixed bag. You had some traditional, some modern synthesizing, but more infusions of modernism. The Tennessee Valley Authority, and particularly programs to help migrant workers in the middle and far west. Often modernism was very frankly used there. The New Deal in the provinces could also encourage a wide range of architectural expression, in some cases encouraging regional forms of expression, picking up on regional historical idioms, often updated and sort of romanticized, Spanish Mission, as the 1930s would express such a building, that kind of thing. Colonial in the East, this sort of amalgam of early American influences restated by 1930s designers. But it was that's where you really got the increased amount of freedom. But most of this was far below the threshold that the modernists felt was their due. They were pleased, of course, that TVA demonstrated modernism, and you get a little bit of it elsewhere, but the modernists were really on the warpath to show that in the nation's capital their philosophy deserved its own monument. And controversies over the Jefferson Memorial and the National Gallery of Art were very, very bitter. But what I want to call attention to today in particular is the tendency to try to mediate that, to try to create an architecture that would give the best of both. Not the designers hope that it would be done in a way that would be effective, that would not give you some sort of an awkward marriage between the classical and modern, but would really fuse the two. And I think that the North Dakota State Capitol is one of the premier examples of that aspiration. There are a number of important ones around the country, but buildings that are contemporary, that blend the classical and the modern into a seamless web of contemporaneity. And particularly the North Dakota State Capitol building is one of a handful of state capitals built in those years that reflect the skyscraper influence. The Nebraska State Capitol, the Louisiana State Capitol, the North Dakota State Capitol are among the premier examples. And we've reached a point now where we can really begin to put these buildings and their legacy into a historical context and framework. They're a good half-century old now, most of them, and they are an important part of our country's architectural legacy. It seems to me that there's a real opportunity here in North Dakota to draw attention to a building the state should be very proud of, that is very important, part of one of the major transition periods in the development of American culture. And I certainly hope that the building will continue to receive the sort of conservation that it has in the past. It's a very important building.
Rightfully so. Going back to the discussion of architects, the period in which the type of styling which we see on the North Dakota Capitol was a brief period in architectural history in this country, maybe 10, 15 years, until the modernist camp began to win out. And we see much more affinity toward their aesthetic agenda being materialized in constructions. So there were plenty of architects during the 20s, the 30s, and even the early 40s who were able to design within this Art Deco mode. Were they just simply well-suited for the needs of the time, or were they able to continue in some success after that when the demands of architecture caused them to go into other design modes?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the years after World War II, design began to shift. Things do not stay stable for very long, and post-war modes began to, well, you could see the origins of a great deal of post-war architecture in the 20s and 30s, these harbingers of what was to come. But by the same token, strict classicism, conservative modernism, call it what you will, this middle range of design that emerged in those years, did continue in a number of places. In Washington, you can find buildings that reflect that spirit as late as the late 1950s, early 1960s. The Dirksen Senate Office Building, subsequently named for Senator Everett Dirksen, was still then very much alive and kicking, was completed in the late 50s, and it's essentially the same sort of stripped classical. I think it's a very successful design on those terms. You can find a number of commercial buildings in Washington and around the country that continue that through the late 50s, early 60s. And what's really interesting is that now there's a revival getting underway in sort of postmodern design, a renewed freedom to use the classical language in contemporary work. And after the 60s and 70s, when the monumental core of Washington was, in my opinion, rather jarred by the intrusion of buildings that showed absolutely no respect for this tradition, now there's an attempt once again to defer where possible. There's a new building on Pennsylvania Avenue on the north side. Federal Triangle is on the south side of Pennsylvania. The north side has been undergoing an attempt at renewal that's now about 20 years old, and the Kennedy administration quasi-public corporation, Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation, was formed to try to give some renewal to what was perceived as a seedy and embarrassing, dilapidated north side of the avenue. And the program put forward by the corporation is a really interesting way to index the changes in the rethinking in architectural and urban philosophy in those years. It's been revised again and again, and in the 1970s a number of preservationists began heatedly objecting to proposals to demolish the Willard Hotel, demolish this, demolish that, and those buildings, many of them have been saved. A number of other important ones were lost. There were some buildings built that that triggered a great deal of revulsion from the minute they were built. The FBI building, named for J. Edgar Hoover, just rammed its way up out of the earth and dwarfed everything surrounding it. Now maybe we're getting used to that building a bit more. But right between the FBI building and a turn-of-the-century newspaper office building that's being saved, the Evening Star building, there's this brand-new project, 1001 Pennsylvania Avenue, designed by a local firm, Hartman Cox, that is the most intriguing salute to turn-of-the-century classicism. It's a new building, and yet it really exudes the spirit of 1910. It's the most extraordinary thing. And that same firm has done a number of other buildings in Washington that express a contemporary version of classicism. So the wheel just continues to go round and round.
The development that you speak of gives witness to the changing needs of modern users of space and modern architecture. What kind of changes have resulted from these needs on the exterior of the buildings within Federal Triangle? One approach, of course, would be to demolish a building and build a new one which meets the needs today. Another approach, of course, would be to adapt a building and to perhaps construct an addition to it, something of that nature. Has there been this kind of change to the plan of the Federal Triangle, one of adding to existing buildings rather than building brand new buildings?
Well, Federal Triangle was never completed. There was the old post office building, and everyone kept waiting for that to be demolished, and now it's not going to be demolished. It was restored instead. So the Federal Triangle itself is now, perforce, rather an eclectic thing. There is now a proposal to complete a key portion of the Federal Triangle in a building that will be, at the same time, contemporary but also contextual to the earlier classicism. Outside of the Federal Triangle, there is no real philosophy right now, I'm sorry to say. Preservationism, and I speak as an unabashed preservationist, made real inroads in the 70s, but it's been really give and take during the 1980s. There is no reigning concept at this point anymore, where we're sort of we're seeking, and at this point it's a case of who can ram through what sort of an approach in a particular case. And the development pressures, the real estate development pressures in Washington are just completely out of control. We're losing vast portions of the commercial downtown all the time. As a historian, I think we really have to save buildings that are demonstrably significant, not just great works of architecture, but played a significant role in the development of our society. As a citizen, it's my personal bias that, especially in a city where the winds of change just seem to be leveling block after block outside the monumental core, as a citizen, I like more continuity. And I think that ways have to be found, together with property owners, to change this destruction, to moderate the forces that are robbing us of so much of our cultural heritage in Washington. And if people come to Washington and get outside the monumental core, I think that in some cases they'll be rather shocked at how much has gone and how new it all is. I'm not against the new, but I think we have to have a decent balance between the old and the new.
Well, it might be that because the monumental core, as you call it, is so strongly preserved and really treated as sacred ground that people can give that attention and give that respect to those buildings and then feel quite
Anything
free.
goes.
Yeah, quite free for anything else
Anything
outside.
goes. Anything goes. That's the historical part, and the rest is all expendable. And alas, no.
Yes.
It's one has the sense that Washington isn't a real city anymore. It's just the grand federal buildings, and then one anonymous corporate headquarters after another, like Dallas. And there are big football rivals, and I think that's perhaps one way to reach Washington citizens. You don't want to be like Dallas.
All right. Well, in concluding, why don't you give some sort of impression to what you've seen on the outside of the Capitol and compare it with maybe some of its progenitors, some of the antecedent buildings maybe that you've seen, something that might have inspired Halliburton Root, who were the architects for the North Dakota State Building, to design something so out of keeping with the tradition of U.S. capitals. Can you see any kind of antecedents?
Well, I think the Nebraska State Capitol building in particular by Bertram Goodhue, which was designed in a competition of 1919-20 and not finished until 1932, this building was hailed all over the country as a salutary new departure in the design of state capitals using the skyscraper or tower motif. I think it's very, very clear that that building was very much in their minds, but Halliburton Root were doing commercial work of this type very widely in Chicago and elsewhere. There was a very clear tendency in the business community to encourage buildings that had a certain dignity and grandeur without being overly opulent or exhibitionist, and this was in many ways a preferred mode for professional office buildings. Is as well, I think that the tendency to try to harmonize classicism and modernism was a powerful one in these years. You can find many, many examples. One of the ones in Washington, a later building, 1940, perhaps in turn inspired by North Dakota, along with others, is Bethesda Naval Hospital on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. I want to stress again that for the state, for the region, and in a national perspective, this building is very important. As I say, one of a handful of state capitals that reflect this type of expression. And it's very, very important to continue conserving the building in its authentic state for the future. This doesn't preclude change, but the custodianship is a real responsibility. I understand there have been some changes proposed, and I hope these will be evaluated with great care so as not to essentially ruin a very extraordinary resource for the state and for the future. I'm sure that changes can be accommodated in harmony with our responsibility to maintain important buildings like this.
Yeah, that is the great weight upon the shoulders of the people who are in charge of caring for the building and planning its continued use. I think that's an appropriate note to conclude on. Again, we've been talking with historian Dr. Richard Striner from Washington, and I appreciate your attention and thank you for coming.